Good morning and welcome to this BSI webinar on exploring DEI excellence. My name's Christina Thacker-Rankin. I'm co-founder of the All in Diversity project and we are the official sponsor of the BSI PAS 1948-2023, Diversity, Equity and Inclusion in the Workplace, a Code of Practice. Welcome. It's my absolute honour and privilege to be able to moderate this session this morning and give you a slight introduction to the document and what its aims and objectives are. We have had a number of questions come in ahead of the webinar and I'm hoping I can address some of those now in the introduction to the PAS. What is PAS 1948-2023? It is not a legal document. The purpose of the PAS is to allow any organisation of any size, type, industry, sector, anywhere in the world to be able to pick it up, read it and develop a strategy that is appropriate for them, the environment in which they operate, the sector in which they operate, geographical location, their stakeholder ecosystem and the customs, religious sensibilities and cultural sensibilities that are particular to them. As such, there is no right or wrong answer. Equally, it is an international standard that is designed to work alongside other national and international standards. So for instance, the ISO standard or other BSI standards which touch upon people management, HR, diversity, equity and inclusion. What makes the PAS 1948-2023 slightly different is our document is not designed purely as a policy document. It also includes practical guidance and a workplace toolkit any organisation can pick up and start to implement. So things like employee surveys, pulse checks and a self-assessment. It does not include reference to any laws or regulations, whether that be in terms of employment practices or data protection. It is up to the organisation to look at the laws that are applicable to it and its specific operational environments and apply them accordingly. We have had a specific question come in about DEI in China. Very, very interesting subject. Unfortunately, we won't have time to cover that this morning. In fact, the scope of the topic is so large. We only have an hour. If we had 10 hours, we would still only just be touching the subject. What we'll do, however, is give you as much time as we can to be able to answer some questions, as well as picking up some of the questions that we will be picking up as part of the advertised webinar session. So without further ado, I am going to ask my esteemed panelists to provide a 30-second introduction of themselves. I'm going to hand over first off to Kelly.
Good morning, everyone, and thank you for having me today. My name is Kelly Higson. My pronouns are she and hers. I'm the Executive Director at Inclusion Included, which is a global consultancy transformation company. We're based out of the UK and we work with clients across the US, EMEA and APAC. My first role in DE&I, Diversity, Equity and Inclusion, was over 25 years ago, and since then I've worked within a range of services and business sectors, including fintech and financial services, mental health and connected fitness, management consultancy and business transformation, and the charitable and third sector. And in the latter part of my career, I focused very much on leadership, coaching and behavioural change, as well as a philanthropic work with the community interest companies and social change organisations. And I'm delighted to be here with other esteemed colleagues supporting the BSI in designing and delivering this important publicly accessible standard on DE&I. So thank you.
Thank you so much, Kelly. And Kelly is incredibly modest. What she forgot to mention is she has played a pivotal part as part of the steering group that has been part of the group of individuals who have helped bring this standard to life. Thank you so much, Kelly. Kim, if I could ask you please to give a quick introduction to yourself.
Of course. Morning, everybody. Thank you for having me. So my name is Kimberly Neville and my pronouns are she, her. I'm the new Senior D&I Manager at Allwyn. So Allwyn UK is a new company in the UK, and we will be taking over the running of the National Lottery from the 1st of February. So a really exciting time. I'm currently wearing 2 hats at Allwyn, so I'm finishing off my senior RBP role, and I'll be moving into the senior D&I manager role full-time next year, which I'm really looking forward to. You know, awareness to action is what we really want to start focusing on next year. We're being really kind of deliberate with our diversity and inclusion and our social value, and making sure that we're embedding it right from the beginning and throughout all of the business. Prior to Allwyn, I was working for a DE&I consultancy, careers platform, and working with clients like Sainsbury's, Jacobs, Engineering, EY, Coca-Cola, and helping them with their diversity and inclusion strategies and initiatives. Great to be here. Thanks for having me.
Thank you so much, Kim. And last but by no means least, Tasneem, if we could please hear a little bit about yourself.
Sure, thank you. Hi, everyone. Thank you for having me, firstly. And my name is Tasneem, and you can call me Taz. My pronouns are she and her. So while working on the PAS document, I was the Global Diversity and Inclusion Lead at Oxford University Press, and have recently moved to HC1 to set up and lead their D&I division. Having over 15 years of experience in D&I, I think this is something that I'm very, very passionate about as a subject. I've worked in different industries and different geographies, which just adds a lot of layers with my own lived experiences and brings about, you know, what I do with every place that I go with D&I. I'm also an ICF certified coach, and I bring a lens of D&I in every coaching that I do. And I sit on the board of directors for Vincent Dance Theatre down south in Brighton to advise on all things D&I. I'm really looking forward to be on this panel discussion with my brilliant co-panelists, as well as Tina, who is going to facilitate the discussion, because it hits close to home. And we have been on a journey on D&I, and our focus this year is from awareness to action and active allyship. So I'm really looking forward. Thank you.
Brilliant. Thank you so much, Taz. And again, Taz also has played a pivotal part in helping us bring this standard to life. As we're covering off the pronouns, I am typically the person who will tick the prefer not to say box. But for the purposes of this particular session, and life in general, my pronouns are Z and Zay. So, Taz, thank you so much for rounding off the introductions. I'm going to start with you, if I may, please. Looking at the concept of equity to begin with, what does it mean? How does it differ to, say, equality? And why, in your opinion, is it so important to ensuring fairness and justice for all?
That's a great question, Tina, and I think it's important and it's high time we start speaking about equity. So, in my opinion, personally, for me, having worked in a number of different sectors and geographies over the year, I truly believe that D&I is unique to each individual. And it's highly subjective. What it means to me may not mean the same to you. And it's important we meet people where they are at in their journey. So our lived experiences, our backgrounds, our external influences as well sets us apart, you know, on how we see the world differently and how it differs. And people may be identifying from the same group could be experiencing D&I differently, and we may have different needs and requirements. So we cannot talk about equality anymore. It's really high time we speak about equity, because just providing equal opportunities for all and expecting colleagues to develop and benefit from it, it's like asking an elephant and a monkey to climb the same tree, you know. So we need to recognize that some of us would need that additional layer of support, and that may differ from person to person. Now, some of you may have also seen the picture where there are 3 kids of different heights trying to watch a baseball game over the fence. Now, you cannot give them the same amount of lift and expect them to be able to watch the game. You need to cater to their unique heights and their unique needs so that people can capitalize on the opportunities that you put in front of them. You know, it's more than a label, I feel. It's not that one size fits all. We should all feel that we can come to work as our own authentic best selves without having to make any conscious efforts to fit and whatever that may look like for each one of us. And I think that is very important when we talk about ensuring fairness and justice and creating that psychological safe space and talking about equity over equality.
That's fantastic. And can I just ask you, if I may, we hear a lot about bringing your authentic self, your genuine self. Would you say we want people to bring their authentic self in every scenario or case?
Well, again, that may differ person to person, wouldn't it? Now, different scenarios would bring the different self of you, and whatever you feel that you're most comfortable with, in every scenario, I may bring this self to this scenario and I feel most authentic in that situation. So it may differ from person to person, it may differ from situation to situation. We all have different personalities, don't we? The way we come to work and the way we would be at a pub with friends, or the way we are at home with children or our parents would be different, but that does not mean that that's not our authentic selves. That is the best version that we want to bring to that situation at that particular point in time. So I think it's very important to recognize that it is all about that unique perspectives. It is all about that particular situation, and it may differ not only from person to person, but as you rightly said, it may differ from situation to situation as well.
Fantastic. Thank you so much. Kim, I'm just going to bring you in, if I may. Would you agree? Would you have a slightly different perspective?
No, completely agree with what Taz has said there. It's absolutely about equity now. So obviously we all started off with equality because that's what we thought was the way to go, but equity is definitely where you need to be. It's taking each individual and looking at their individual circumstances and kind of meeting them where they are and providing the right support and infrastructure required for either that situation or that individual. And in all, we're right at the start of our kind of DEI journey with this, but equity will absolutely be what we're kind of focusing on. And as a small example of what we're hoping to do in the future, looking out into our supply chain, looking at the different kind of size of suppliers, and what we'd like to do by 2027 is with our micro businesses, we're going to try and look to reduce our payment terms by 7 days, because they've got different infrastructure and they require different support. They potentially can't wait for the same payment terms as some of the larger companies, and that will kind of hopefully help them and increase our supplier base as well. So equity is absolutely the right way to go.
Fantastic, and a fantastic example there as well, if I might add. And our conscious time is getting on, but I know Kelly will have a huge amount of expertise to bring to this question as well.
I think just to build on what Taz and Kim have shared, I mean, for me, it's a really simple, foundation of life. Being able to live your authentic self and bring your whole self to your workplace, to your home, and I guess in the many communities that we exist in, is just simply the right thing to do. And I think there's an element of, if you have to hide part of yourself, if you have to hide part of your identity or quieten elements of who you are, that's really exhausting. And just imagine if that effort that you're spending trying to hide part of yourself could be used in your contributions at work or at home or in your communities. That extra effort that you're putting in there could just transform your experiences elsewhere. So for me, it's just a simple foundation of life, and it helps us to create a global society where everyone can thrive.
Fantastic. And that, oddly enough, I think takes us nicely into the next area of discussion. I'm going to stay with you, if I may, Kelly, because this particular question, I think, plays very nicely to your actual brand. It kind of says what it does on the tin. So in your experience, how do we go about starting to actually create that culture of inclusivity? And how do we go about welcoming diverse experiences, perspectives, views when we've kind of been same old for so long?
Such a great question, Tina. I think one of the foundations of creating an inclusive culture is to start with a really clear definition of what an inclusive culture is. And I guess by this, I'm not referring to an industry standard, but I think it is really helpful to look at examples of best practice and to understand, the culture of competitors and other high-performing organisations. But what I'm referring to really is an inclusive culture that is relevant for your business and the legislation and the nuances of your markets that you operate in and the demographics of your organisation and also the organisation's values. So when we have that definition, and I think it's really important that it should be co-created with the involvement from key contributors across the organisation, it's really important that that definition is then embedded within the entire organisation's purpose. So this means making sure that your leadership and your team members and your customers and your suppliers are really on board with that definition. And that inclusive culture, whilst it serves as your North Star, it also needs to be flexible enough to evolve as data, insights and knowledge become available. And then I guess a building block on that foundation is then to start to create or to embed or to maintain, depending on where your organisation is, psychologically safe spaces where all those in your business know they can contribute to the inclusive conversations and inclusive culture that you have. And this means, in practical terms, making sure that there is space for everyone to innovate, to have diversity of thought and experiences, and to create environments where collaboration is really encouraged and valued. I think sometimes we forget that compassion, empathy and active listening skills are really true leadership competencies, and that these need to be assessed for at interview and monitored throughout the performance and appraisal processes too. And again, importantly, team members need to know the value of their inputs when they are creating an inclusive workplace and culture. And this needs to be done through things like recognition schemes that reward behaviours and that are conducive to supportive environments where everyone feels they can be their whole self. A couple of final points on that then. So the additional build then would be to ensure that leadership is aware of their professional and personal responsibilities to lean into creating inclusive cultures. And it doesn't require leaders to be experts in creating inclusive cultures, but it does require leaders and accountable bodies to really understand any gaps in their knowledge and to take all the opportunities that are available to continue to grow in this space. And this might feel, that there's a vulnerability there, and leaders may feel anxious to speak about this. But vulnerability coupled with drive and action to address gaps in knowledge, particularly around inclusive practice, is one of the most important leadership skills there is, and one that actually drives business performance. And of course, that's just the beginning of creating inclusive cultures. As your organisation matures and evolves its competency in this area, I'd recommend a couple of additional things, which are to just check in and think about which team members are speaking up and involved in designing that inclusive culture. And then importantly, who isn't speaking up and involved? And even more importantly, why aren't those people speaking up, and what does your organisation need to do to change this situation? There's a really simple model, the you said, we did model. So create a constant loop to feed back what the business is hearing and how those insights are being used to create inclusive cultures. And don't forget also to include any timeframes that you've committed to in terms of delivering an inclusive culture. And if something can't be implemented, then make sure you feedback and explain why it can't be implemented, and particularly why at this time. And then finally, don't forget that there are very, very many different environments where subcultures lie. So think about the physical and digital environments. Think about what inclusive culture looks like for those that are in your corporate offices and those who maybe are remote in your hubs or your retail spaces. And what does it feel like for those who are part-time or perhaps in other time zones? So an inclusive culture may look very different in each of those locations.
Just before we move on to Taz and get her and Kim's views, I think you perhaps touched on it in your response and your kind of overview of what inclusivity might be and how you go about doing it. But increasingly, we're now kind of seeing an acronym DEIB.
Yeah.
So when we talk about belonging, is that kind of linked more to the inclusivity side, or would you say there's a slight nuanced difference between the two?
Yeah, I think there is a nuanced difference. I mean, everybody, should feel that they belong somewhere in society, in home, in work. And you have to remember that sometimes work can be a space of safety, and it can be a space where connections are created. And that sense of belonging is really, really important within the workplace. I think the inclusive culture work actually drives a sense of belonging, and when people feel they are part of a group or that they belong within the workplace, they're better able to thrive, they're better able to contribute their whole self and all their skills and abilities to helping a business succeed and creating better outcomes for not just the business but for their own career progression too. So belonging is so important in the DEI and B space.
Fantastic, thank you. I've seen you all kind of nodding along, listening to Kelly. So, Taz, if I can come to you first to share your thoughts on this.
Absolutely. I think what Kelly did mention, all of it, I would definitely agree. But I think just to build on what Kelly said, for me, the critical answer to this question would be psychological safety. And I think she spoke about, the workplace is a place of safety. And you would only be able to bring out the cognitive diversity, or as we call it, the diversity of thought, and create that inclusive culture if people feel safe to speak up, if they feel that their contributions are being valued, if they feel that they're being heard in whatever way that would be, if they feel that we are respecting and embracing those differences. And what organizations need to do is obviously promote the benefits as well. Look at case studies that have happened in the past wherein the cognitive diversity was not considered, and what were the ripple effects of that, and where it was considered and how it made competitive advantages, the sense of that. So I think we need to look at weigh the pros and cons and create that kind of an awareness as well, so that people embrace it. And you may not be agreeing to different perspectives. You don't have to agree to different people's views and viewpoints, but that does not mean that either one is wrong. I may look at the digit as a 6, but where you stand, you may look at it as 9, but we both are right. It's very important that we embrace that at the same time to create that sense of inclusion. But as Kelly rightly mentioned, it may differ from people to people. I may be working remote, I may be working part-time, I may have flexible hours, I may work in the office, and how it would differ from people to people. But at the same time, how we are creating that sense of serendipity, how we're creating that sense of psychological safety. And I think leaders would play a very important role in doing that. You walk the talk. So if I am comfortable bringing my vulnerable self to a virtual room, how am I creating that space for others to do that, having no fear of whether I'm right or wrong? This is something that I feel that I should speak, and this is my contribution to this particular topic. And that's where you will be able to welcome those diverse perspectives and experiences that we call. And eventually, hopefully in the long run, we are looking at an inclusive culture. And that belonging piece that you spoke about, that would come after. So that's my 2 cents to this.
No, I think I would say it's a little bit more than 2 cents. I'd say there's a good couple of $100 in there at least. Huge amount there. And Kim, I saw you nodding along to absolutely everything both Kelly and Taz have said. Please, let's get your perspective.
Well, I think they've made my job easy there. They've kind of answered it all fantastically, and I couldn't agree more. So yeah, absolutely, the psychological safety and the inclusive spaces. And like Taz said, you need to create that space where you can have safe disagreements, I think, because like Taz says, you're not always going to have the same perspective and neither person is wrong. But to grow allyship and education and awareness, you have to make those, everyone's on a different part of their D&I journey, right? And everybody's got different knowledge. So people have to be able to make a mistake and feel okay about that, as same as you have to create the inclusive culture that people feel that they can call out that behaviour that's not correct. So the inclusive culture is all encompassing. It's not just calling out the behaviour, it's also those people that potentially are right at the start of their D&I journey feel safe enough to come along with us and help us. And that's how we're going to kind of grow the allyship. And then the point of belonging, absolutely, it's kind of the nuance again between equality and equity and inclusive and belonging. Belonging is where we want to get to, and that's really tricky because that's a personal feeling. So inclusive is, we've got the right policies and initiatives and we're being inclusive, but that might not still give you a sense of belonging, Tina, because that's personal to you. So that's why it's really tricky, and that's the place that we want to get to, and that's why it's really important. So yeah, I think But yeah, in terms of all the practical stuff, fantastic what Kellyanne has said.
Fantastic. Well, listen, yeah, whilst you've got the microphone, I'm going to stay with you, if I may. We've had a lot of kind of terms come out at the start of this conversation, you know, safe spaces, psychological safety, allyship, belonging, inclusivity. Something we hear a lot, really from organisations who think this is perhaps the start of addressing DEI in a workplace, is unconscious bias. Yeah. For so long, it's let's throw unconscious bias training at it, and that's a start or part of the solution. But what exactly does unconscious bias mean? And how can we recognise it? And then how do we go about addressing unconscious bias in both personal and professional contexts?
Yeah, great question. And it is, well, we could, you know, spend an hour, 2 hours on unconscious bias, but I'm going to keep it really short. So I assume that the majority of people on the call will kind of be familiar with the term or have an understanding, but just so we're all on the same starting point, I'm going to read the definition as per our wonderful PAS document. So it is the unintended or unintentional assumption, bias or prejudice applied to decision making and other processes that decision makers are not consciously aware of. So decision makers are not consciously aware of. So the key is in the title, unconscious bias. We don't know we're doing it. You know, these are deep-rooted beliefs, stereotypes, thoughts, feelings that we hold on an unconscious level and that our brain will kind of access at speed without us knowing it. So our brains are very clever things, and they can process something crazy like 11 million bits of information a second. But on a conscious level, we can only process about 40 or 50. So what that means is that your brain is constantly making lots and lots of cognitive shortcuts and taking many unconscious decisions. And it's a good job we do, because otherwise, you know, we'd all be kind of walking around in circles and short-circuiting. So we need our conscious and our unconscious minds. Okay, so how do they get there? How do we form these unconscious biases? And you might be thinking to yourself, and I've had people say to me, but I don't have any unconscious bias, Kim. I'm a very forward-thinking, inclusive kind of person. You know, I believe in meritocracy. I don't have unconscious biases. And that's, you know, that's great that you think that, but we do. We all have unconscious biases. And anybody that says they don't, they need to kind of maybe do some training. So what they are embedded in us from years and years of social conditioning, from the media and the press that we consume, from our backgrounds, from our experiences, our social circles, our parents, our schooling. And all of these different experience, conversations and media that we consume, our brain is kind of putting it into different groups, patternizing everything and saving it for later on, so when it can make an unconscious decision when it needs to. So to bring it to life, what it means in kind of real life and the effects that it has is that we can unknowingly and unintentionally affect people's lives with some of the decisions that we make. Now that sounds quite dramatic, but especially in kind of the people space, whenever there's a decision to be made around people, it really can have an effect. So for example, you might promote or reward somebody that's not really deserving of that just because we like them. You know, we've got a bit of affinity bias, and I'll go into what that is in a moment. Or transversely, you might hinder somebody's career advancement or not put them through to an interview or for a promotion because of a prejudice that I hold against somebody due to an unforeseen kind of unconscious stereotype that I hold. So there's lots and lots of different unconscious biases. I think if you look them up, there's about 151, and I won't go through them all now. I'll just bring to life kind of the main four that we see at work. So affinity bias I've touched on. That's where we favour somebody that, you know, is deemed to be like us. They share similar experiences. It might be somebody that you're interviewing and you see that they go to the same school as you, so you've got an instant kind of connection with them. So you might kind of score them more favourably. Confirmation bias is another one that we see quite a lot at work. So that's where we search for information or interpret situations to back up our preconceived or our unconscious idea about a candidate or a situation or a person. So to keep it with the candidate in the interview scenario, a candidate might arrive 10 minutes late, and then you'll look for further evidence within that interview that they've got poor time management skills or lack of organisational skills, and you'll selectively focus in on that, and you'll look for information that backs up your bias. So that's your confirmation bias. Conformity bias is another big one that we see at work. So that is where, and you see that a lot in groups, so where you change your opinion to match that of the group. So again, you might be doing some group work, there might be 3 or 4 of you in the group, 3 people have a different opinion to yourself and you don't feel strong enough to disagree, so you kind of go with the group. So rather than questioning that and bringing your idea, you conform to the group's consensus, and that's really dangerous. So that's where we get groupthink. And another real kind of problem one that we have at work is source bias. So where you get your information from and who do you trust? It's generally felt that if you have a strong relationship with somebody, you're more likely to rely on that information, be it correct or accurate, but it's going to be more heavily weighted than, you know, potentially somebody that you don't have a relationship with. So that's a real kind of whistle-stop tour of what it is, how we get it, and some main ones that we see at work. So how do we address unconscious bias and what do we do? Like you said right at the start, you know, unconscious bias training, the first thing to do is to bring your awareness up. Let's talk about it, let's look at what it is and let's learn about it. If you've got the information, you can kind of look out for the pitfalls. If you do some unconscious bias training with somebody at work, maybe get yourself a little unconscious bias partner and you can call out each other when, you know, if you're seeing unconscious bias in the workplace. There are certain tests that you can take for you to become more aware of your biases. You might not know what they are, and again, there's all sorts of different things out there and tests out there that you can take to bring those to your conscious mind. And to slow down your thinking. So when you're faced with a people decision, so whether that's interviewing, promotions, assigning work, anything like that, just really slow down your decision making and question what you're doing. And again, there's lots of different models for this, but there's one that I quite like, which is preferred, tradition, or required. So when you're making decisions, ask yourself, is it my preference? Do I just prefer that person because, you know, I've worked with them before or we went to the same school? Is it tradition? Is it that Tina was great at this role, so I'm just going to find myself another Tina, or give it to Tina because she's done it before? Or is it required? So if it's a requirement of the role, the project, you know, the interview panel, then that's great, carry on. If it's slipping into preferred or tradition, there's possibly a chance there that some unconscious bias will be slipping in. And again, if you slow your decision making down, it will just give your conscious brain time to catch up and to question what you're doing. And then just some real kind of holistic things in the day-to-day, what you can do is just expand your network and your social circles, expand your social media consumption and who you follow on your socials, follow different influencers who are from different backgrounds and have got different characteristics to yourself, and read and educate yourself, read. The more you can read and look at different viewpoints, that will really, really help with your unconscious bias and seeing things from a different perspective. And yeah, just to kind of tie back into our previous point about creating an inclusive culture, I think if we get that right with the psychological safety, that's where we really feel like we can challenge those unconscious bias behaviours. But again, have that safe space for making mistakes and learning and growth. So that's a real kind of whistle-stop tour on unconscious bias. Like I say, you can have, you know, training courses for 2 hours on it, but there we go.
Well, listen, I'm going to kind of bring Kelly and Taz in a second, but I think you've just finished on a couple of really interesting points where you talked about social media. You also talked about inclusivity. What I'm starting to come across, and it's so new, there's no real term for it. I've heard it called tech bias, tribal bias, where people who perhaps are not engaging as much or with the right groups in social media, that is starting to kind of impact now. You know, you're not on TikTok. Why aren't you on TikTok? What's wrong with you? You're still using Facebook. What that, you know, the rest of the world has moved on to Threads or Insta. Is that something you're starting to see a little bit? And how do we even start to kind of unpick that, given technology is going to be such a kind of driving force within society and the workplace?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, tech is evolving at the speed of light, isn't it? And like you say, you know, you've got your Snapchats and your TikToks and this, that, and the other. And again, you just kind of have to do what feels comfortable for you and what feels right for you. So you'll see some people that are really kind of vocal on social media and other people that potentially aren't. And then in terms of kind of what you're consuming on that social media, that's a bit tricky as well because of all of the algorithms. So if you start to consume one type of media, that will then continue to serve that to you. So you have to be really kind of conscious of trying to select different viewpoints and different sources, so you don't get that source bias, you don't get that one, you know, kind of narrow view of what's going on in the world. I think you've got to be tech's fantastic, but you do have to be a little bit careful with it.
Fantastic. Thank you so much. Kelly, Taz, I suspect you're both chomping at the bit here. Kelly, I'm going to come to you first, if I may, and get your perspective.
Thanks, Tina, and some really great comments from Kim there. I was just thinking about the confirmation bias, and I think sometimes we use the term halo and horn bias, and I feel that really resonates with a lot of the teams that I work with. So that is holding a view on someone based on something they have done really, really well or really poorly. And as Kim talked about, you know, the interview, being late to the interview, and just using terms like halo or horn really helps us to understand, you know, what we're actually looking at when we talk about bias here. But there are some other biases we often forget, including things like accent bias. How someone speaks or presents, for example, at interview or over the phone or in our conversations, can often lead us to have a particular view on that person. And there are some accents that may seem either more educated or uneducated because of the sound and the lyrical pattern of those accents. So we have to remember that when we're hiring people or when we're having conversations over the phone. There's also appearance bias, which often exists again in the interview process. You know, making a judgment based on how somebody appears or looks or how they show up in a particular set of circumstances. And the other one I think is often forgotten about is experience bias. So, for example, Simon leaves your business, you immediately want to hire another Simon who's had the same experience, the same background, comes from the same school or the same economic background. And we think to ourselves, why do you need another Simon? Would Sally be equally competent? Or would Simran also be equally competent in this space? So experience bias really plays out in the workplace too. But the one thing I just wanted to quickly touch on was something we've heard a lot about over the last couple of years, and that's the effectiveness of unconscious bias training. And there's lots of schools of thought on this, some suggesting that unconscious bias training really has its place in the workplace, and others suggesting not so. I think the most important thing to think about is whether it's unconscious bias training, DEI training, cultural competency training. The most important thing is to understand the impact you're trying to achieve and the stickiness of that content. So what will change as a result of your team or your leadership or your clients going on to unconscious bias training or any other type of behavioural change training? If you can't identify the impact and that stickiness to that, then I think it's time for us to go back to the drawing board and say, are there any alternatives to helping us achieve the change that we're trying to achieve by implementing any form of bias training or culture training?
Thank you so much for that. Taz, can I get your perspective? I mean, Kim said there's 151 biases, so I'm sure you can throw a little bit more in there as well.
Absolutely. Well, I'm so excited that we are talking about unconscious bias, because we all have unconscious bias. And to be honest, I think some of you have already touched on it, that sometimes it's necessary for us to work on a daily basis. You know, a simple thing like, you might be walking down the street and you sense danger. Your mind and your body will automatically become more vigilant. So sometimes those snap judgments is necessary for us to work on a daily basis. But when not recognized and addressed in a work setting, how is it impacting our business decisions? How is it impacting our people decisions? I think that's very important. And one thing that I really believe is, we all have the heuristic bias, like the most recent experience that we have had in recent time is going to play out in everything that we do. Something that we see when we are, let's say, answering an employee survey questionnaire. Whatever recent experience, whether good or bad, is going to reflect in the way you answer your employee survey questions. And that's something that we see very often. But what we also don't recognize is giving the benefit of doubt is equally important. That sometimes we can have healthy conversations, sometimes having those calling in that unconscious bias, the way we are actually trying to position it rather than calling out, because calling out was having a little negative tone to it. So we tried to change the positioning of it internally, nothing big. We have started calling it call in. So you have your in group, as some of you were talking about the confirmation bias. You have your in group and you have your out group. Whoever you're most comfortable with, they can be your call in buddy. That, oh, you did something. Can I, just things like, why did you think like that? Just trying to understand your perspective, nothing more. And just having those healthy discussions, and the conversation doesn't need to become a conflict. It doesn't need to become a confrontation. And it can just be understanding different perspectives. A most important thing is also considering the impact versus intent bit. Like, nobody has intent to be malicious or impolite or rude to someone. But having said that, what is the it created on the person on the receiving end? I think that's something that we should really, really consider. And having said that, again, I think many a times unconscious bias is very subtle. It's a series of microaggressions as well, and it is priming at places, and which might become a little tricky to recognize and address. So that constant awareness building, that constant information download, the constant workshops, the constant dialogue between people is equally important to understand. Where is that unconscious bias playing in the business? Is it hiring? Is it promotions? Is it just team meetings? And just making sure that you call that in, because I think Kelly did mention about different biases, and she spoke about how someone appears to be, or the accent bias. And you might come across instances that you're in a meeting and you've said something which was not heard. And the same thing is repeated by someone else, and then you start feeling like an imposter. You start getting that imposter syndrome. So it's very important that others act as an ally, say that, oh, I just heard Taz speak about the same thing. Let's hear her views on it. So Kelly would say that, oh, I heard Taz speak the same thing. So you that space to call that in, but also at the same time being an ally. So it goes hand in hand. And there are so many different types of unconscious biases. Yes.
Yeah, I think just the subject of unconscious bias or biases could take us a long time to kind of unravel, and as soon as we finish there'll be new biases popping up. That's fantastic. Listen, we've got a few questions coming in, but the great thing is I think that they fall very beautifully into some of the other things we're going to talk about this morning. So what I'm going to do is shift tack a little bit now. We've kind of talked about some of the generics, the terminology, the stuff everybody's heard about. But let's see if we can start looking at the practices now. So one of the questions is, is there a risk of overkill? And how do you go about achieving the balance, the right balance, which I think takes us on to the next subject that we have tabled to talk about. So I'm going to kind of come to you first, Kelly, if I may. Based on your different experiences, do you think that there really is a one-fits-all solution? And how do you go about reviewing and assessing, evaluating the skills and tools that an organisation might need to drive initiatives forward?
That's such a great question. I think, my experience would lead me to believe that there is no one size fits all. And that's because all organisations are at different stages of maturity and thinking around this particular subject. And they also have different resources available to them. They may have a large budget that they can throw lots of money, have a big team. They also might be incredibly modest or conservative in their spend in this space. And that means we really have to lean into individual skills that are available and present across that particular business or that organisation. So I don't think there is a one size fits all tool or approach that we can use. And actually part of the standard is to enable people and organisations to work through that document and actually find the right solutions for them and their organisation, and also the problems they're trying to achieve, try and solve for. In terms of reviewing the skills and the tools that are needed to really drive the DE&I initiatives forward, one of the things I always say to our clients is, what do we mean by a DE&I initiative? Because that label can sometimes be hard to engage with. Are we just talking about simple good practice within an organisation? So if you take, for example, DE&I initiatives within hiring practices, Arguably, there are, really helpful DE&I initiatives that you can put in place, but surely the whole point of really good hiring practices is to take account of diversity, equity, inclusion, belonging, and culture within how you operate. So I think that's the first question back. And then there's a secondary piece for me, which is around, are we talking about initiatives and events and activity that are led by a diversity team? Because the skills that are needed in that team, for example, technical or academic competencies or influencing and engagement skills, may be very different to that's what's needed elsewhere in the business with perhaps function leads or leadership or individual team members. So if the DE&I initiative, let's call them, are being led by another business function or a leader, for example, for me, there should be an element of grounding around why the initiative is being implemented and what the problem is being solved for. So let's really dig deep into asking questions and having a skill set around really considered curiosity. Is a phrase that we use in our business all the time. Having that considered curiosity is about deep diving into questions around, what is the issue at hand here? Where does our data and our evidence and the insights that we have lead us to into trying to solve for a particular problem? Another skill set that we would recommend employing is being really brilliantly bold. And that goes back to something I touched on earlier, which was around trying to, at the very early stages, identify the impact and the change that the initiative is trying to achieve, and setting performance indicators and metrics that help you measure the change. And then saying to yourself, with our limited resources, let's say we're talking about an organisation that maybe is smaller in size, with our limited resources, if we can't identify the impact or the change that we're trying to achieve in the first instance, I guess the question back to ourselves is, why are we doing this in the first place? And it goes back to that conversation before around, is this overkill? Is it a DE&I initiative, or is it just simply good practice? There's also another point for me, which is around constantly active audits of an organisation's policies and practices across the business. Now, we talk all the time about not putting additional burden on already marginalised communities in having them identify and fix behavioural and systemic issues such as bias or discrimination within those practices and policies. But it is really important to bring them to the table, to have our diverse populations come to the table and be able to have a say in looking at policies and processes and how they are implemented across the business, and to see if they are reflected within the language and the practical application of those policies. So I think the three things for me would be having active auditing skills that happen across the business, and that could be teams of individuals or individuals looking at policies and processes, being brilliantly bold in identifying both the impact and the change that you're trying to achieve and setting those key metrics in terms of how you'll measure that success, and then having that employed skill of a considered curiosity, which is leaning into and really digging deep into why we're trying to problem solve in the first place. So going right back to data and evidence that we have available.
Fantastic. I have to admire your skill in taking a very, very complicated situation and distilling it really down into ABC. Fantastic. Taz, I can see you grinning away there, but also nodding away as Kelly was speaking. What do you think?
Absolutely. I think she really touched on key subjects there, because you are talking, whatever you're doing in an organization when it comes to ED&I, you need to go back and see whether it's translating into actions and behaviors, whether, do you have the right measurements? Do you have the right tools to equip your leaders, but also audit what initiatives that you're doing? Is it going in the right direction? And keep doing that on a regular basis, because D&I is evolving exponentially, and what you thought might be the right thing to do a year back may not be the same thing right now. So make sure that you are keeping it flexible, making sure that it's a dialogue, a transparent, organic dialogue that has the flexibility to evolve on an exponential stage, as well as D&I is evolving on the exponential stage. So leadership capability, inclusive leadership would be two definitely good skill sets to have. And it's not necessary that this is for leaders or managers who are managing people. Everyone can lead D&I in an organization. You cannot achieve D&I in isolation. It is everybody's responsibility. It's a shared responsibility. the inclusive hiring bit, the inclusive meetings, equipping managers and colleagues to have those difficult conversations, and making sure that you're being respectfully curious. If you have a question, ask respectfully. Nobody's going to feel offensive about it. And launching D&I resources, continuously awareness building, and carpet bombing on the different D&I topics is equally important. Making sure that we are creating that kind of an awareness, making sure we are making enough noise around diversity and inclusion so that it's at the forefront of people's mind, and they are embedding D&I in everything that they do in the business. It's not only people decisions, but it's also product decisions. So let's say I'm producing a book or an illustration. Is the book inclusive enough? Is the illustration having any kind of stereotypes? So making sure that it is a whole package when it comes to D&I. And that's when you are driving the D&I initiative within the organization, but also making sure that you have the brand reputation for an external branding. Are your suppliers inclusive as well? So it's like a whole package for me. Yeah.
Fantastic. I mean, it's almost like an onion, isn't it? We peel away one layer, there's another thing to consider. Peel away that layer, another thing to consider. Just before we start moving on to the final questions, just conscious of time, Kim, again, I've seen you nodding away as Kelly and Taz have been speaking. Be great to get your perspective on this as well, please.
Yeah, absolutely. Like you said, I think the way Kelly distilled it down was fantastic. The short answer to is there a one size fits all is no, absolutely not. Everybody's at different points, different journeys. I think what was interesting also what you said was the question prior to the question that Kelly answered in terms of D&I fatigue. Can we get it right and how much do we do? And that's a real tricky one, and it's really important to address. So I don't get D&I fatigue because I find it really interesting and I could talk about it all day, but I'm aware that other people do. So I think from a business point of view, I think what you need to do is work closely with your strategy teams, with your comms teams, and make sure that it's fed into all of the other communications plans that are going on, and just have a real kind of thoughtful, considered approach to what you're doing and when you're doing it. And again, to link it back to what Kelly said, make sure you're communicating the why and the how. We're not just asking you for this sensitive information because we just want to see it. What are we going to do with it? What's the purpose of it? I think that's really important to get buy-in as well. So one of your allies at work will probably be the internal communications team, and the strategy team if you have one, to try and like Taz said, embed it across the business. It's not just for the people team or the HR team or the recruitment team. They're obviously the ones that it touches on a day-to-day basis, but D&I is absolutely everybody's responsibility. So yeah, trying to embed it across the business, and then just the metrics and the measurement. What you don't measure, what's the phrase? What you measure gets done, I think, is that the phrase. So if you don't measure, you don't know where you're starting from, you don't know what your progress is. So you absolutely have to measure as well. Sorry, I'm spinning through because I can see the time as well. I'll hand back to you. Thanks.
Do you know what? Yeah, I am absolutely marveling at how much information is coming out today in such a short period of time. And yes, we have around 6 minutes left, and we've got questions coming in thick and fast. Apologies, we're not going to be able to pick them all up. But a question we had slightly earlier on, and I think this touches to what you just said, Kim, in terms of D&I is everybody's responsibility. But I'm going to go back to Taz to start off this final question. So for organizations starting from zero, how do you go about developing an effective action plan to start implementing DEI strategies? And one of the questions we've had is senior management leadership buy-in, but also the challenge of perhaps generational conflict, older generations perhaps having a different perspective and getting the buy-in. Conscious of time, I'm going to ask you if you can do it in 2 minutes, and then we'll get the other two in.
Absolutely. I think I'm conscious of time too. Now it's just 5 minutes left. So I think it's going back to understanding where the organization is at their journey. So there are a lot of frameworks out in the market which explains what are the different stages perfectly. And the standard document has some great quick wins, and highly recommend viewing the free resource because it has some great insights. So we definitely need insights and data to back it up. And if the organization is at stage 0, I think there might be a need to go back to the organization, go back to the colleagues and understand what exactly is it that they need. So in our organization, we have a global representation, not only in terms of our colleagues, but also end customers, suppliers, and the representation of the partners we work with. So a person sitting, let's say, in Madagascar, we want that voice to be heard as well. So we did a lot of listening sessions. We want to hear everybody's voice and make sure that they feel that they are represented in the strategy that is being launched. Only then will they embrace it. So we build our strategy based on what we heard from different regions, spoke to more than 1,500 employees. We analyzed the data that we had, not all the data that we had, because we were also starting at 0, the themes that came out from it, and then we had a global vision. However, as I said, one size does not fit all. So although you may have a global vision, your regional approach might differ based on the region's priorities. One size doesn't fit all, coming back to that, So the way you launch the strategy, you may have a global theme, but the approaches of different regions, different geographies, different offices might differ. So you need to consider those as priorities. And it's also important to tell the people what we are using the data for. So have those reports being transparent. Okay, if I'm taking this data, this is what I'm doing with that data. This is how it's helping me. And that's when you also get the buy-in, because if I may have selected prefer not to say, but if I see that this data is being used for something, the next time I am on there, I will add my data on it. So I know that, okay, this is the ethnicity data that's being promoted, and that's how they are using this particular data. So D&I cannot be achieved in isolation, as I said. And D&I targets are just half the story. That's how I feel. The practice and outcome is equally critical. So the workshops, the upskilling is critical, yes. But what are those learnings? Are those learnings getting translated in behaviors? How are we tracking that? What is the sentiment analysis telling us? How is it changing? Diversity can be seen and measured in data, but inclusion is a feeling that we need to monitor too, if we truly want to create that psychological space, safe space, and an inclusive culture where everyone can thrive. So, mindful of time, I'm going to stop there.
So if I hear you right, it's you've got a high level policy, but it is delivered in a culturally competent way at a local level. Fantastic. Thank you so much. Kim.
Hello. Right, 30 seconds. So we're kind of in this space at the moment in Orwin. Like I say, we're pretty much a startup in the UK. So we're being really kind of deliberate with our strategy and our social value strategy. So we're sat in the strategic and corporate affairs function. We're not sat in the people team. We're looking holistically across the business. We have social value leads in each business area. So rather than, again, just putting it on your D&I team or your ERGs, we're not spoken too much about them today, but they're really important. But going back to what Taz said earlier about not expecting, minority groups to always do the work, in each business area, we're going to have these social value leads to bring that together as well. And also make sure that you look externally, not just internally. So we're not just looking at our workforce, we'll be looking into our supply chain, our retail strategy, our good cause distributions, how we engage with the regulator. So yeah, to kind of have a real kind of holistic approach to it.
Fantastic. Thank you so much. Kelly, last but by no means least.
Sure, I'll keep it really brief. I think for me, for an organisation starting from scratch, I'd say find your own DE&I DNA. So have a look back over your trading or business history over the many years, or even if you're a new business, look at what this could look like, and find key moments of inclusion which have really positively impacted others, and then celebrate this and bring others into those celebrations and look for ways to replicate not the activity but the impact. And that for me would be my sort of 30-second summary of where you would maybe start from.
Fantastic. As is always the way with a really important but engaging conversation, as people start to digest, we start to get more questions coming in as people start to think a little bit more. So I think I'm going to go back to the BSI and see if we could perhaps do a follow-up session to try and capture some of the additional questions we haven't been able to pick up. What I have taken away, and certainly those of you who are trying to unpack this big ball of wool that is DEI. Firstly, equity. For those who aren't sure what it is, it's asking an elephant and a monkey to climb the same tree. You need to make allowances. You need to adjust the individual to the task. When it comes to inclusion, a simplified approach is you said, we did. And when we're talking about biases, there are over 150 biases and growing. You need to start with yourself. And as Kim said, if you don't think you have a bias, then that's probably not going to get you very far when it comes to a D&I strategy. Ladies, based on your pronouns, thank you so much for sharing your experience, your insight, your wisdom, your knowledge. Attendees, thank you so much. And of course, thank you to the BSI for not only helping us with the standard, but with today's session as well. Thank you, everybody.
Thanks so much, everybody.
Thank you all. Thank you.
Thank you, everyone.